Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Lurking Hour. It was 3:15 a.m. when the first disappearance occurred. In the midst of New York City's familiar buzz of distant traffic and hum of the occasional passing siren, a woman named Elena Miller stepped out of a crowded subway station in the heart of Manhattan. The night was a blanket of chill and quiet, a lull before the storm of morning commuters. But Elena didn't make it far. Her footsteps slowed as if pulled by invisible strings, her gaze vacant. And then, without a word, she vanished into the mist, her body dissolving into the very air she breathed, leaving only a faint, cryptic message scrawled on the sidewalk in chalk: "Find the clock that never ticks." At 3:16 a.m., Detective Marcus Finch was roused from his uneasy sleep by the ringing of his phone. He had only been on the force for 5 years. Yet there was something about the late-night calls that unsettled him. The urgency in the dispatcher's voice only added to that unease. "There's been another one," the dispatcher said. "It's like the others. A disappearance." Same time. Finch's pulse quickened. The disappearances were becoming more frequent, each one occurring with eerie precision at exactly 3:15 a.m. He had been tracking the cases for weeks now, but with no answers, only more confusion, more chilling evidence left behind. The investigation begins. By the time Finch arrived at the scene, the usual crowd of curious onlookers had gathered, their faces lit by the pale glow of streetlights. Elena's colleagues were there, their eyes wide with fear, speaking in hushed tones. Finch moved through them without acknowledging their presence, his mind already working through the layers of the case. The chalk message on the ground was the same as before, cryptic and unsettling. It seemed to shift and change under the dim streetlight, as if it were more than just words. It felt alive. Finch knelt down, squinting at the chalk. His gut told him there was something deeper at play. He rose and turned to Officer Harris, who was standing nearby. Harris had been assigned to the case from the beginning, and the rookie cop was unnerved by the circumstances surrounding these disappearances. "Any witnesses?" Finch asked. "None," Harris replied. "She just vanished. One moment, she was there, and the next, nothing." Finch glanced at the time on his watch. 3:20 a.m. Did anyone hear anything? Finch pressed. "Nothing unusual," Harris said, "but there's this strange hum, like a low buzzing sound, right before they vanish. Some of the witnesses reported hearing it." The hairs on the back of Finch's neck stood up. He had heard similar reports before. The humming, the inexplicable disappearance at the exact same time, nothing about this made sense. A pattern emerges: the disappearances were occurring with increasing frequency, always at the same time, always the same eerie message left behind. The next victim, Darren Simmons, was found 2 nights later, his clothes discarded in the alley where he had last been seen. The message, this time, read, "Find the clock that never ticks." Finch couldn't shake the feeling that these messages were part of something larger, something that transcended mere coincidence. He spent hours poring over old case files, searching for any link, any pattern that might shed light on the mystery. That's when he found it, a forgotten legend, a whispered tale of a ritual that occurred at precisely 3:15 a.m. a time when the boundary between the living and the dead thinned. It was said to be the hour when the lurker could slip into the world of the living, using the time distortion as a gateway. The ritual was ancient, passed down through generations of shadowy figures who remained hidden in the dark corners of the city. Finch's fingers trembled as he turned the pages of an old occult book, uncovering a description of a clock that was said to control the lurker's movements. A clock that never ticks. Finch knew then that he was dealing with something far darker than he had ever imagined. The lurking hour. As Finch continued his investigation, he learned more about the victims, each of them with no clear connection except for one unsettling detail. They had all been in some way connected to the clock tower in Washington Square Park. This historic landmark, or relic of the city's past, had been the site of strange occurrences for decades. The locals whispered about the clock, a timepiece that had mysteriously stopped at 3:15, exactly when the disappearances occurred. No one could explain why it had stopped, but there were rumors, strange legends passed down from generation to generation, about the clock's original purpose. It had been built not just to tell time, but to regulate it, guarding the threshold between the living and a parallel dimension, where something terrible waited, hungry, for the moment the clock stopped ticking. Finch's investigation led him to a forgotten room beneath the clock tower, hidden deep within the foundations of the city's oldest and most intricate labyrinth of tunnels. Here, in the dark, Finch discovered something both shocking and horrifying: a massive clock, its face shattered, its gears spinning in endless loops, its hands frozen at 3:15. As Finch approached, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the low, buzzing hum he had heard before filled the air, vibrating in his bones. Suddenly, he was no longer alone. A figure stepped from the shadows, its face a blur of shifting darkness. Finch's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the form. It was a twisted reflection of the victims who had vanished. Their eyes were wide open, their faces twisted in eternal agony. What are you?" Finch demanded, his voice shaking with both fear and determination. The figure smiled, its teeth jagged and sharp. "We are the lurker's children. We are the ones who've crossed over. And soon, you will be one of us." The ritual. Finch's mind raced as he pieced the puzzle together. The disappearances weren't random. The victims were being pulled into another dimension, a nightmarish realm where time flowed differently. Each victim was absorbed into the lurker's world, becoming part of its twisted army. The clock tower was the key, the nexus where the ritual took place. But why now? Why had it all begun again after all these years? Finch's pulse quickened as he realized the answer. Someone had awakened the clock, allowing the lurker's influence to bleed into the world of the living. The clock tower was the doorway, and every 3:15 a.m. it opened a path to the dark dimension where the lurker thrived. The victims weren't merely vanishing, they were being pulled through that door, forced into a timeless, hellish landscape where they would be trapped forever, consumed by the lurker's hunger. Confronting the lurker in a final attempt to stop the ritual, Finch confronted the figure beneath the clock tower, demanding that it release the trapped souls. The lurker's children surrounded him, their eyes burning with hatred and sorrow, as if they had once been human. "You cannot stop it," the figure hissed. "Time will always be its servant." The clock began to toll, its hands moving slowly toward 3:15 once again. Finch knew he had mere moments to stop the ritual before another soul was taken. With a sudden burst of strength, he smashed the clock's face, shattering the glass and sending the gears grinding to a halt. The buzzing hum grew louder, but Finch stood firm, determined not to let the lurker claim anyone else. The lurker screamed in rage, its form writhing and distorting as the dimension began to collapse around them. For a moment, everything went silent, and then, with a violent surge, the lurker's presence was gone. Aftermath. Finch woke to the sound of his own breathing, realizing the clock had stopped, permanently. The disappearances ceased, and the city returned to its usual rhythm, but the memory of the lurker's children haunted him. Though the case was closed, Finch knew that somewhere, out of sight, the clock would always be waiting, ready to strike again when the hour came. Story 2: The Siren Song. Evan Doyle had always believed in the power of music. As a renowned composer, he had spent decades shaping symphonies, sonatas, and operas that had earned him acclaim across the world. His name had become synonymous with mastery, a perfectionist who could coax beauty from every note, who wove emotions into melodies with the precision of a surgeon. Yet, for the first time in his career, the music had stopped. For months, he had been trapped in a void, unable to write a single note. His piano sat untouched in the corner of his apartment, its black keys as cold as his creativity. His mind had been a cacophony of ideas that refused to form into anything cohesive, like static on a broken radio. Desperate to break the block, he sought solitude, a place where his mind could uncoil, free from the distractions of his fame and the bustling city life. He found that place in the coastal village of Harrow's Hollow, tucked away on the northern shore. The village was isolated, surrounded by jagged cliffs and thick forests, with only a handful of residents, fishermen, artists, and retirees who had long since disappeared into the rhythms of coastal life. The town's only attraction was its quiet, and that, for Evan, was enough. The first night in the small cottage that he had rented, Evan could hardly sleep. The bed was uncomfortable, and the room smelled faintly of mildew from the damp sea air, but what kept him awake wasn't the discomfort, it was the sound. At first, he thought it was the wind, a playful breeze tugging at the eaves of the cottage. But then, there was a melody, a strange, haunting tune, woven in with the whistling of the wind. It was soft at first, barely audible, but the more he listened, the clearer it became. The notes reached him, one by one, slipping into his mind with a familiarity that both intrigued and unnerved him. It was unlike anything he had ever heard, a lullaby of sorrow and longing, both serene and mournful, as if it was calling to him from deep within the earth itself. Evan was no stranger to music, but this sound, this melody, was otherworldly. It drifted through the cracks of his windows, floating on the salty breeze. Each note was like a brushstroke against his very soul, stirring something deep inside him that he could not name. He rose from his bed, his heart pounding in his chest, and opened the window. The melody filled the room, now unmistakable, and he felt an undeniable pull toward it, a magnetic force that made his pulse race and his skin prickle with a strange anticipation. As he stood there, bathed in the pale moonlight, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the very night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Evan closed his eyes, allowing the music to flood his senses. It was beautiful beyond words, a divine composition, as if every note had been composed for him, just for him. The longer he listened, the more he felt himself slipping away, as if the melody was winding itself around his thoughts, pulling him into a dreamlike state. The wind carried it further, its direction shifting, and the music faded as if it were an illusion. The silence that followed was suffocating. Evan stood frozen by the window, unsure of what had just happened, unsure of whether it had been a dream or a waking hallucination. But he knew one thing for certain: the music had reached him, and it had planted something inside him that he could not ignore. The obsession. The following day, Evan attempted to focus on his work. He tried sitting at the piano, pressing his fingers against the keys, but no melody came. Nothing felt right. The memory of the song lingered, haunting him, and he realized that nothing could hold his attention for long. His thoughts kept returning to the sound he had heard the night before, the sweet, perfect melody that seemed to call him from the deep. As the days passed, the song returned each night, drifting on the winds that blew through the village. Every time, it was a little clearer, a little louder. It was as if the song was becoming part of him, an intrusion he could not escape. Evan began walking along the cliffs at night, his gaze cast toward the ocean. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but the pull of the melody was irresistible. Something deep within the waves seemed to beckon him, to pull him closer with each passing night. Each evening, he would wander the darkened streets of the village, the quiet broken only by the whisper of the waves below and the soft hum of the song in the wind. The villagers were oblivious to the music, and when Evan tried to ask them about it, they simply shrugged. Nothing unusual, the old man at the local tavern told him with a grin. It's the wind. Always has been. But Evan knew better. He had lived his life surrounded by music, and he had never heard anything like this. It was not a natural sound. It was a voice. A voice that seemed to call to him in a language older than time. The truth beneath the waves. Evan's obsession grew. He stopped composing entirely, consumed by the melody that played night after night, luring him toward the cliffs and the sea. It was on the fifth night, as he stood at the edge of the rocks, staring out into the vast, black expanse, that he saw something. At first, it was a faint shimmer in the distance, like a ripple across the surface of the ocean. Then, as the music swelled, the shimmer grew clearer, closer, and there, beneath the surface of the water, he saw the outline of something enormous, a figure, moving slowly, deliberately. It was vast and undulating, its shape impossible to define, but its presence, undeniable. His heart raced, and he felt a pull so strong it almost made him stumble into the waves. He had to get closer, had to understand what it was that was calling to him. The song, the creature, the sea, it all made sense now. He wasn't merely hearing a melody. He was hearing a summons. He didn't know how long he stood there, entranced by the shimmering figure beneath the waves, but when he finally snapped out of his stupor, it was too late. He had crossed the threshold. The figure was gone, vanished into the depths, but the music remained, louder now, sharper. It sang to him, wrapped itself around him like a lover's embrace. And Evan knew, he knew with a sickening certainty, that the creature was waiting for him. The song wasn't a melody. It was a lure. And he was the prey, the creature's power. Over the following days, Evan's mind began to unravel. The song had taken root inside him, buried deep within his consciousness, its siren call filling every waking moment. He began hearing it during the day, a faint echo in the back of his mind, constantly tugging at his thoughts. He couldn't escape it, couldn't focus on anything else. He began to learn more about the creature. The villagers spoke of it only in whispers, of an ancient sea creature, a being from the depths, whose song could possess the minds of those who heard it. It was a creature born of the darkest depths of the ocean, a being older than the stars, capable of bending minds to its will. Its song was its power, its weapon. And once it had a hold on you, there was no escape. Evan's thoughts grew scattered. He couldn't tell if he was writing music or just scribbling nonsense. The sheet music on his desk was filled with lines and shapes that had no meaning, no structure. The notes were just a blur, like a fevered dream that couldn't hold its shape. The melody in his mind only grew stronger, more insistent. On the seventh night, Evan stood on the cliffs once more. The song filled his ears, his soul, and he could feel it pushing him, urging him to dive into the depths below, to surrender completely to its call. The water looked black and endless, the waves crashing against the rocks in a rhythmic pattern, like the beating of a heart. He knew he was losing himself. But the song, oh, the song, was beautiful. It was everything he had ever searched for in his music, everything he had ever longed to create. And he realized, with a sudden clarity, that he had become the song's vessel. It was not just his obsession, it had become him, and he was becoming it. He stepped closer to the edge of the cliffs, his body moving against his will. The music sang louder now, overwhelming him, filling every inch of his mind. The creature had won. The final note. The villagers found Evan the next morning, his body cold, his expression vacant, as if the life had been drained from him. His fingers were still twitching as if playing an invisible melody. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of how he had died, only a single note, scrawled in the sand beneath his feet: "The song never ends." Story 3, The Reflection of Madness. Dr. Nora Hitchens had always prided herself on her keen intuition, but as she sat in the sterile confines of her office, surrounded by the antiseptic aroma of disinfectant, she couldn't shake a growing unease that gnawed at her chest. It was a sensation that had begun subtly, creeping in like the edge of a dream at the periphery of her consciousness, and now, it held her attention fully. The cause? A series of unsettling patients who had been sent to her over the past month, each one bearing witness to a level of disturbance she had never encountered before. The doors to the ward whispered open, and Nora glanced up, her eyes narrowing as she watched a young woman shuffle into her office. She was dressed in a pale, stained gown, her hair wild and greasy, falling in tangled clumps over her face. Her eyes, rimmed with red, darted around the room, bulging and darting, as if searching for something to escape or seize. Nora felt a jolt of apprehension. There was something feral about the way the woman moved. "Ms. Ruther," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a note of curiosity. "I'm Dr. Nora Hitchens. Please, have a seat." The woman paused, her body stiffening. She regarded the chair in front of Nora's desk as though it were a threat rather than an invitation. Her eyes flitted back to Nora, and her lips pulled back in a snarl. "No," she rasped, her voice hoarse and brittle. "No chair." Nora frowned, sensing a thickness in the air, a vibration just below the surface of her patient's words. She studied the woman, noticing the way her gaze seemed to fixate on something beyond the physical confines of the room. It was as if she were staring directly into a void. "Ms. Ruther, please," she said softly, her tone gentle but firm. "I need you to sit down." "Can you do that for me?" The woman's eyes widened, her pupils dilating further until they eclipsed the whites of her eyes, turning them a milky haze. Suddenly, she hissed, baring her teeth, and sprang forward, her hands reaching out in a blur. Nora instinctively recoiled, her heart slamming against her chest. The woman's fingers passed through the air, leaving a trail of unseen force that sent Nora's breath stuttering in her throat. "No!" the woman screeched, her voice raw and distorted. "I'm not here. I'm not here." Nora scrambled back, her eyes widening in alarm. The woman's face contorted, her reflection in the mirror behind her flickering like a dying flame. It shimmered, wavering as though in a wave of heat, and as Nora watched, the woman's eyes, ears, and mouth moved with a slow, unnatural rhythm, independent of her physical form. And then, just as suddenly, the woman collapsed onto the ground, whimpering and clawing at her scalp, her body convulsing violently. The air in the room thickened with the scent of fear and sweat, and Nora felt her own pulse surge, a cold dread gripping her limbs. For a moment, Nora stared at the woman lying crumpled on the floor, her gaze locked on the distorted reflection in the mirror. It hung there, gleaming and sinister, mocking her. It wasn't a reflection but a thing, an entity that breathed and writhed, as if alive. As the woman slowly stilled, Nora approached her cautiously, her eyes still fixed on the mirror. The entity within the glass glared back at her, and she felt a surge of terror wash over her. The eyes staring back at her were not the eyes of the woman, but something ancient, something watching, waiting. Nora knelt beside the woman, pressing her fingers against her carotid artery, feeling the faint pulse beneath her skin. The violent thrashing had subsided, and now, the woman lay still, her body quivering, her breath ragged and shallow. Trembling, Nora turned back to the mirror, her eyes burning into the glass. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. The reflection quivered, and the eyes blinked. And then, in a voice that echoed from the depths of her soul, a whisper filled Nora's mind. "You know," it rasped, each syllable laced with menace, "I am what you cannot escape." Nora leaped back, her eyes widening. The room spun, and the terror she had felt was replaced by a surge of anger mingled with fear. How could something that wasn't flesh or bone speak? The moment stretched, and a low, guttural chuckle spilled forth from the mirror, echoing off the walls. Nora scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide. She backed away from the woman, her eyes never straying from the mirror, her hands shaking. The reflection within the glass had changed, twisting and deforming, the features shifting as if they were malleable. The eyes that now peered back at her were not the eyes of a person but of something eldritch, glowing and ravenous. Nora turned her gaze back to the woman on the floor, her mind struggling to grasp the reality unfolding before her. The woman's eyes fluttered open, meeting Nora's gaze, and her voice was barely audible, her tone a cracked whisper. "It's always watching," she said, her voice hoarse and laced with terror. "It knows. It waits." Nora knelt again, reaching out to grasp the woman's trembling shoulders. "Who are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice firm. The woman's eyes focused briefly, a flicker of clarity returning. She met Nora's gaze, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "The mirrors," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They're alive." The words hung in the air, carrying an unspoken weight that sank deep into Nora's chest. Her eyes drifted back to the mirror, and she felt as though she were gazing into the eyes of a predator. In that moment, Dr. Nora Hitchens knew she had encountered something beyond her understanding, something that defied her rational mind and her professional training. Nora spent hours examining the woman, who eventually lapsed back into a state of catatonia, muttering incoherently. She documented every detail of the incident, her pen scratching frantically in her notebook, her gaze drifting back to the mirror over and over, the reflection shifting, warping, and staring back at her with eyes that burned like smoldering coals. The rest of the day was a haze of questions, concern, and escalating dread. It was the last of a series of patients whose behavior had left her unnerved. Just weeks prior, she had begun noticing peculiar incidents, a man convinced that his reflection was mocking him, laughing and repeating his movements seconds before he could. Another woman had described a voice that whispered her name at night, always in sync with the sight of her own image, even when she was alone. The next morning, Nora made her way to the psychiatric ward, her heart heavy, her mind awash with the residue of the night's unsettling visions. The facility was located in the outskirts of the city, a place where she dedicated herself to studying the mysteries of the mind, unperturbed by anything outside the boundaries of her research. Yet, something about the last few weeks had her questioning that certainty. She found herself entering the room of her next patient, a young man in his early 20s. When she stepped inside, she froze, her eyes widening. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the mirror that adorned the wall across from him. His hands clutched the sheets, his knuckles white, and his eyes had that same wild, unhinged look that she had come to dread. Nora stepped closer, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Simmons," she said softly. The young man didn't respond, his eyes fixed unwaveringly on his reflection. It was as though he didn't hear her, didn't even see her standing there. He muttered, barely above a whisper, "It's calling me again." Nora hesitated, glancing at the mirror. The light in the room dimmed, and she saw the reflection begin to flicker, the surface quivering like a pool of water in a windstorm. "What's calling you?" she asked, her voice tense. The man's head turned slowly, his eyes blazing, his pupils dilated to nearly black. He looked directly at her, and his voice echoed, disjointed and primal. "Don't listen," he growled. "Don't let it get inside you." Nora's blood ran cold, her heart pounding in her chest. She forced herself to remain calm, stepping closer. "Mr. Simmons," she said, her tone firm, "who is it that's speaking to you?" The young man turned back to the mirror, his expression twisting into a sneer. "It's always there," he hissed, his voice filled with fury. "It wants me to open the door." Nora glanced at the reflection, and a wave of horror washed over her. The image in the mirror was contorting, shifting grotesquely. She watched in horror as the eyes stared back at her, eyes that glowed with an unholy light. "Open the door," the reflection intoned, its voice dripping like venom. "Let me in." Nora's vision wavered, her body trembled. She stumbled back, her eyes fixed on the distorted face staring at her with twisted glee. The air became thick, the sound of the young man's voice echoing louder, reverberating like a heartbeat in her chest. The young man lunged at the mirror, his hands slamming against the glass, and Nora shrieked, her voice echoing off the walls. "No!" he screamed, his eyes wild. The reflection leaped back, slithering and contorting in a frenzy. Nora's eyes watered, her hands covering her ears. In the next instant, the young man fell backward onto the bed, his eyes rolling up into his head, his body trembling violently. Nora stared at the mirror, her gaze fixed on the warped image, her mind reeling. It stared back at her, grinning, its teeth dripping with dark fluid. It chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent her reeling backward, her eyes welling with tears, her chest aching. Somewhere in her head, a single thought rang out: she had to get out. Over the following days, Nora began piecing together the fragments of information she had gleaned from her patients, trying desperately to find a pattern. Each of her encounters had centered around mirrors, and the violent episodes that seemed to seize them appeared linked by a mysterious force that went beyond the confines of science or psychiatry. Nora dug into the history of the facility, seeking clues in dusty archives and patient records dating back decades. The more she researched, the more she felt as though she were being drawn into a vortex, each discovery deeper than the last. She uncovered legends and whispers, tales of strange phenomena that had haunted the asylum long before its official founding. Tales of mirrors that had a life of their own, and of entities trapped within their gleaming depths. Aging photographs depicted older patients, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in terror, staring fixedly at the same mirror that adorned the walls of the present ward. The stories were garbled and inconsistent, but there was one common thread: those who witnessed the reflections often claimed that their eyes had changed, as though possessed, and that the mirrors held something of a sentience, something imprisoned within the glass that fought to be free. As Nora pieced together the fragments of evidence, she found herself questioning her own perceptions. Her nights had become nightmares, filled with distorted reflections, eyes that followed her movements and whispered her name. The entity had whispered to her more than once, taunting her with promises that it would find her, just as it had found her patients. And then, she remembered something: the young woman's words, "It's always watching," and her other patient's insistence that it was a door. But what kind of door? Nora needed answers, and she was determined to find them. She immersed herself further into her research, spending long nights scouring documents and exploring the depths of psychiatric lore, psychology, and mythology. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. According to legends, mirrors were gateways, not just reflections of the world, but windows into realms beyond. Over centuries, superstitions had always warned that these reflective surfaces could trap and unleash forces too ancient and potent to understand. In the most disturbing accounts, some mirrors had been said to harbor demonic presences, ancient beings imprisoned by rituals long forgotten, but never proven. What if such a thing existed, dormant, and had somehow found a way to break free? As Nora uncovered more clues, she stumbled upon a reference in an old journal from the late 1800s, belonging to a doctor named Alistair Preston. Preston had been an esteemed researcher and physician who had experimented with mirror therapy, believing that the mind could be healed through the correct manipulation of one's reflection. However, his notes detailed instances of patients exhibiting symptoms akin to her current cases, and Preston had written that the reflections seemed to have a will of their own. He described patterns of behavior that echoed Nora's own experiences: faces changing, voices whispering from behind the glass, and eyes that took on a life apart from the human skull. Preston's entries became more frantic as the months passed, detailing visions and dreams that had haunted him, and ultimately, he had ended his research abruptly, dying under mysterious circumstances. As Nora read through the faded ink, a sickening realization dawned upon her. Preston had witnessed something unspeakable, and now, she had stumbled onto the same horror. She had always prided herself on the scientific method, but now, her belief in reason and reality teetered on the brink of destruction. As the realization sank in, Nora began to understand that the entity imprisoned within the mirrors was not merely a reflection but something far more primal, something that used the mirrors as conduits, spreading madness and despair. And if she wasn't careful, it would turn its gaze upon her, as it had on her patients. One evening, as the moon hung low in the sky, a frigid wind seeping through the gaps in the windows, Nora found herself standing in her own living room. She had managed to escape the hospital for a short time, seeking refuge in her apartment, but even here, she felt watched. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the television, but her eyes kept wandering back to the mirror on the wall opposite the couch. As she sat down, she felt a prickle along her skin, her palms damp with sweat. The air hung thick, and a whisper echoed at the edges of her thoughts. "You cannot hide," the voice murmured, and Nora gasped, her body freezing in place. Her eyes shot to the mirror, and the image within flickered, distorting and rippling like water in a storm. Nora stared, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes widening. The reflection was not her own, but something else, something predatory and ancient. The eyes gleamed, and as the face twisted, it contorted into a wicked, toothy grin. "You belong to me," the reflection growled, the words scraping against her eardrums like a blade. Nora screamed, leaping to her feet, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she backed away from the mirror, her eyes fixed on the image that pulsed and vibrated, hovering just beyond her comprehension. The entity leaned forward, and the eyes locked onto hers, a hunger in their depths that she could feel reverberating through her chest. Nora whimpered, her body stiff with terror. And then, the entity spoke again, its voice echoing like 1,000 voices roaring in unison. "Let me out," it commanded. Tears poured down Nora's cheeks as she clutched her temples, unable to look away. "I command you," it hissed, its eyes blazing. Nora felt something inside her shift, a jolt of electricity coursing through her veins. Her mind filled with images and memories, all linked to that face, that voice, and the horror that had plagued her patients. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp, its glass shattering on the hardwood floor. The spell was broken, and the reflection wavered, fading back into her own image, albeit tinged with shadows and confusion. Nora fell to her knees, her chest heaving, her eyes fixed on her trembling hands. She realized she was sweating profusely, her pulse racing out of control. As she looked up, she met her own eyes in the mirror, and for a moment, it was as though she saw something change behind her pupils, a flash of something wild and unhinged. Terror washed over her. The voice spoke softly, echoing in her mind, "Soon." Nora spent the remainder of the night barricaded in her apartment, her eyes fixed on the mirror, refusing to look away. As dawn crept over the horizon, she realized that she was no longer convinced of her own sanity. Her eyes had a haze to them, and she saw shadows dancing at the edges, seen only when she blinked, or in the corner of her vision. By morning, she knew she had to take action. She returned to the hospital, her posture rigid, her eyes gleaming with determination. She knew what she had to do, even if it cost her everything. Her first order of business was to research Preston's earlier work. As she had suspected, he had devised a way to suppress the phenomenon, but the process had been excruciating, both for the patients and himself. Preston had discovered that certain frequencies of sound and light could be used to break the connection between the entity and its host. Nora spent hours tinkering with the ward's equipment, piecing together clues and patterns. She felt as though she were playing with forces that defied her training, but something within her refused to back down. Late into the night, after testing various stimuli, she found a combination that seemed to agitate the mirror but did not allow the entity to fully emerge. It was a tenuous hold, but it was a start. When she finally slept, she dreamed of the mirror and of faces that twisted and peeled away from one another, each one more monstrous than the last. She awoke with a scream, her eyes wide and her hands trembling. Over the next week, Nora dedicated herself to a pattern of observation and experimentation, monitoring her patients closely, each time feeling as though she was taming a force that would soon overwhelm her. She honed her methods, creating a shield of light and sound that could repel the entity, even if only temporarily. But as she began to formulate a plan to expose the truth, she felt the reflection watching her, its eyes gleaming, its hunger palpable.
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting, just for you.